22 years. That's how long I'd called this place home. Cedar Ridge wasn't just a neighborhood, it was the first piece of land I truly made mine. I remember the day I signed the first development papers as clearly as yesterday, blueprints in one hand, coffee in the other, a stubborn streak in my chest. Back then, this place was barely more than winding dirt roads and wishful thinking. No fancy fences, no manicured flower beds, just land wild and full of promise. I was part of the original development team, not a big shot. Just one of the quiet ones in the back room helping draw up the paperwork, the plat maps, and, most importantly, the deed restrictions. Back then, we weren't trying to build a kingdom. We wanted a neighborhood where people could plant roots, raise kids, and maybe retire without having to measure their mailbox height twice a year. The deed I helped write had room for life in it, for change, for people. That's what I thought anyway. Now, more than 2 decades later, I stood on my front porch and held a certified envelope in my hands, stamped with that seal I'd grown to loathe: Cedar Ridge Homeowners Associations. The paper inside was sterile, overly formal, and written with that unmistakable mix of arrogance and legalese. It informed me that I was in all violation of 6 neighborhood regulations, including non-conforming facade paint color, improper shrub spacing, and this one made me laugh out loud: failure to comply with aesthetic harmony standards. Aesthetic harmony. I stared at my 2-story Craftsman cedar siding, green shutters, the same forest green paint I'd had for 20 years, and wondered who these people thought they were talking to. This house hadn't changed since the day it passed inspection. But clearly something else had. The HOA had changed, and not for the better. I'd noticed it starting about a year ago. The newsletter changed tone, less neighborly, more authoritative. There were more complaints filed, more notices, tacked to community boards. They replaced the soft-spoken president, a retired schoolteacher named Gloria, with a man named Matt Ridley, young, eager, the kind of guy who believed rules made the world safer even if he had to make them up as he went. Matt wasn't alone. He brought a crew with him. Freshly printed polo shirts with Cedar Ridge Compliance Committee stitched on the chest. Clipboards. Drones for aerial inspections. I'm not kidding, actual drones flying over our backyards. The neighborhood felt different. Quieter, but not in the peaceful way. It was the kind of quiet you get when people start watching their words. I tried to stay out of it. I was retired. Spent most mornings pruning the small garden out back and tinkering with my woodworking projects in the garage. My wife had passed away 4 years ago, and in many ways, this house had become a part of her memory. The porch she painted, the swing she insisted on adding, the hydrangeas we planted together the year our daughter went off to college. I didn't need a new paint job or different shrubs. I needed to be left alone. But the letter made it clear they weren't going to do that. According to the HOA, I had 15 business days to remedy the noted violations or face escalating fines and potential legal action, including but not limited to property liens. I chuckled at that last part. Property liens, they said, on my property. The irony of it all was almost comical, because the very land they were threatening me over, the restrictions they were citing, I had written them. Every line, every comma, every clause back when this place was still hopeful, not hostile. I kept all the originals, of course. Not out of paranoia, out of principle. I was the kind of man who believed in keeping records, in backing things up, in making sure truth had a paper trail. But I also knew better than to walk into a fight half-cocked. Something told me this wasn't just about shrubs or paint. There was something deeper happening, a shift in power, in purpose. And I'd seen enough HOA horror stories to know how these things spiral. First come the warnings, then the fines, then the threats, and then, if you push back, the real war begins. Hearings stacked against you, legal pressure from firms hired by the board, gossip campaigns from the compliance club moms. It wasn't just about rules, it was about removal. I looked out at my street. Some of the original neighbors were still here. The Millers 2 doors down, old Dennis and his corgi. Ruth, who'd been on the first gardening committee. But many of the houses now had new faces. Younger families, Silicon Valley transplants. People who liked the curated feel of Cedar Ridge. People who hadn't been around when the creek overflowed and we all shoveled mud at midnight, or when we built the park swing set with donated lumber and blistered hands. They didn't know the roots of this place. And they didn't know me. I set the letter down, poured a cup of coffee, and pulled open the cabinet where I kept the safe key. It was time to dust off some old truths. Not because I wanted a fight, but because I wasn't going anywhere. Not after 22 years. Not now. The next few days were filled with quiet observation. I've always been more of a watcher than a talker, a habit I picked up in my years working in municipal law and land use planning. You learn more by listening to what people don't say than what they do. So I watched the new HOA board members move through the neighborhood like rookies on a mission, measuring mailbox heights and peering at roof angles with apps on their phones. Matt Ridley, the new HOA president, was the poster child of ambition without wisdom. Early 30s buzz cut, and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He moved here just under a year ago, but by month 6, he'd secured a seat on the board and rallied a handful of younger residents to run with him. Their campaign slogan, "Restore Order, Reclaim Pride," made me roll my eyes when I first saw it. Order from what? Pride in what? This wasn't a failing city. It was a neighborhood full of decent, hardworking folks. We had our quirks, an occasional gnome collection gone wild. A neighbor who liked to play bluegrass too loud on weekends. But that was life. That was community. To Matt and his group, though it was all chaos, their first official act was to expand the HOA's authority. They proposed a new set of aesthetic compliance standards, overhauling the original design guidelines from 2 decades ago. It was packaged like a harmless modernization, but I read every line. The wording was slippery, vague terms like neighborhood conformity and property cohesion that gave the board wide leeway to determine what was acceptable. It passed with barely a whimper. Most residents didn't even attend the vote. That's how they do it under the radar between the lines. Next came the Beautification Committee, which sounded nice until you realized it was just a way for them to deputize volunteers to issue photo citations and peer over fences with digital measuring sticks. They handed out flyers that looked like parking tickets. One neighbor, a widower named Carl, got a $75 fine because his trash can was visible for more than 6 hours after pickup. 6 hours. Then there was Amy Tran's sweet woman, in her late 60s, who had the nerve to install solar panels without prior approval. She got slapped with a non-compliance warning and told she had 30 days to remove them or face daily fines. Never mind that she had every right under state energy codes. They threatened her anyway. That's when I knew this wasn't just a bunch of overzealous neighbors. This was a power play. The goal wasn't order, it was old control. I started taking notes, not because I intended to act immediately, but because I knew how these things played out. They start with warnings. Then the board justifies its budget increases. Next, they bring in legal counsel. And after that, it's all we have a fiduciary duty, and per RCC Plus and ours, while homeowners get buried in paperwork, stress, and bills. And Matt, he was everywhere. I'd see him walking the street in that navy polo, clipboard in hand, stopping to chat with new families, shaking hands like he was running for mayor of a town he hadn't earned. He didn't say much to me, but I caught the looks, that flicker of annoyance when he saw my yard, untouched, my shutters the wrong shade of green, my garage slightly older than the ones remodeled last year. I was a blemish on his perfect map, and I knew it. Then came the HOA meeting notice. It arrived the same day my daughter called to say she and the grandkids were coming for a weekend visit. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. But instead of planning meals or cleaning the guest room, I found myself staring at a piece of cardstock that read, "Some mandatory compliance review. Concerning property 217, Willow Creek Lane. Date Thursday, 7:00 p.m. Location HOA office. Mandatory compliance review." That's HOA code for trial. I was being summoned like some tenant farmer on trial before the crown. The notice didn't even list what the complaint was. Just that my property was under review for persistent nonconformity. The kind of phrase designed to sound legal but meant to be intimidating. Well, I'd drafted plenty of those in my time. What they didn't know, what no one on that new board seemed to understand, was that Cedar Ridge's foundation was built on something stronger than bylaws. And it was built on intent, and I still had the original documents to prove it. See, back when Cedar Ridge was incorporated as a planned community, we filed our deed restrictions with the county registrar and the city planning office. As part of that team, I personally drafted a series of clauses to protect long-term residents, those who built homes before the HOA was formally constituted. The language was clear. All original deed-holding residents who constructed property on their land prior to the formal establishment of the HOA in 2001 shall be grandfathered in with full exemption from future design or aesthetic modifications imposed by subsequent administrative bodies. I remember typing that clause myself. I remember the argument we had about whether to include it. Some thought it was unnecessary. I insisted. I said, communities are built by people, not boards. Let's make sure we don't forget that. And now, 22 years later, they had. That clause had never mattered until now. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what I'd written, but they were about to find out. The days leading up to the meeting were oddly quiet. No more letters, no more citations. Just that one looming appointment on my calendar like a storm cloud that refused to move. I spent my time getting my papers in order. Pulled out the file from my old briefcase, yellowed with age, but still sharp in its clarity. I reviewed everything: signatures, county stamps, property plats, original architectural guidelines. I made copies, highlighted sections, wrote up a short legal memorandum the way I used to when preparing for city hearings. Then I mowed the lawn, trimmed the bushes, cleaned the windows, because if they wanted a battle over aesthetics, I'd give them curb appeal that could be photographed for a magazine. But what I really wanted, what I'd always wanted, was simple: to be left in peace, to live out the rest of my years in the house I built with my own hands. The house where my wife and I grew old together. The house where every creak in the floorboards carried a memory. The house that stood not just on a street, but in history. And no board, no polo shirt, politician, no self-appointed committee was going to take that from me. Thursday arrived with the kind of humidity that settles deep into your joints and refuses to leave. The kind that makes your skin sticky and your patience short. I'd spent the morning sanding down a piece of maple I'd been working on for a rocking chair, a gift for my granddaughter's 7th birthday. But my hands couldn't focus. They moved through muscle memory, sanding, shaping, smoothing, while my mind kept drifting back to that one piece of mail pinned above my desk. Mandatory compliance review. I wasn't nervous. I was prepared. But I'd be lying if I said the weight of it all didn't sit heavy across my shoulders. HOA meetings were never truly about discussion. They were about domination. Designed to make you feel like the intruder on your own porch. And this meeting, I knew, would be no different. But before I could even put on my shoes to leave, another envelope arrived. This one thinner, more casual looking, almost like a flyer. It had that same HOA seal embossed at the top. Inside were 6 separate notices of violation, each detailing a failure to comply with a different HOA regulation. Apparently, in the span of just a few days, my property had become a hotbed of chaos. Violation number 1. Fence color does not match updated HOA palette. Violation number 2. Lawn edging exceeds allowable height by 2.5 inches. Violation number 3. Non-native plants visible in front yard. Violation 4. Exterior lighting wattage unapproved. Violation number 5. Improper storage of woodworking equipment visible from street. Violation of 6. Unauthorized placement of rocking chairs on front porch. Potential hazard. I stood in my living room reading each line twice. I was almost impressed by the creativity. I mean, unauthorized rocking chairs. Was that even a real thing? Each violation carried a $75 fine and a warning that repeated infractions would result in compound penalties and potentially a lien on the property. I let out a low whistle and walked back into my workshop. The rocking chair sat in the center, halfway sanded, innocent as could be. I looked at it like an old friend being falsely accused. That was the moment it all became clear. This wasn't about my yard, my lights, or my porch. This was a coordinated attack. An attempt to flood me with enough bureaucratic nonsense that I'd either give up, comply blindly, or get pushed out. But here's the thing about me. I don't bend easy, especially not to bullies with badges they printed at Staples. I arrived at the HOA meeting 10 minutes early. The room was already half full, residents sitting on folding chairs, arranged in neat rows, all facing the front table, where the board members were beginning to gather. Matt Ridley sat in the middle, of course, his nameplate unnecessarily larger than everyone else's. On either side of him were Karen Dahl from Lot 18, who never smiled, and Brian DeWitt, the treasurer who once fined a man for hanging a wind chime. I took a seat in the third row, my manila folder thick with documents resting across my lap. They didn't call my name until almost an hour in. The agenda was bloated with budget adjustments, landscaping contracts, and a motion to limit Christmas decorations to understated themes. Finally, Matt leaned into his mic. Next item, 217, Willow Creek Lane. Compliance hearing. I stood and walked slowly to the front, not out of hesitation, but out of principle. I wasn't rushing to their rhythm. I was walking to mine. Matt gestured to the seat across from him, like he was some kind of judge. Mr. Harrow, thank you for coming. This won't take long. I didn't sit. He blinked. You're welcome to have a seat. I prefer to stand. There was a pause. Then the usual performance began. Matt cleared his throat and read through the 6 violations I had already seen that morning. He referenced bylaws, page numbers, subclauses, each delivered with a tone that implied he expected me to nod and apologize. I didn't. When he finished, he looked up and gave that practiced, pitying smile. We're happy to work with you on bringing the property back into alignment, but failure to act will result in fines, liens, and if necessary, further legal intervention. I opened my folder. The sound was deliberate, the kind of crisp paper shuffle that gets attention. From it, I removed a copy of the original deed restrictions. The real ones. The ones filed before the HOA even existed. I held them in the air and said, are you aware that your current aesthetic guidelines contradict the foundational governing documents of Cedar Ridge? Matt's eyebrows arched, but he recovered quickly. Mr. Harrow, we operate under revised bylaws ratified by the community vote. I nodded. I'm sure you believe that. But according to County Clerk File CR01-1442, the original deed restrictions include a clause section 4.3b, stating that any resident who built on their land before the formal establishment of this HOA is exempt from future design or aesthetic mandates. I handed him a copy, and another to each board member. Each one stamped, notarized, and indexed by the county. The room was quiet. A few residents shifted in their seats, leaning in. Matt flipped through the pages, lips tightening. I don't recall seeing this clause, he muttered. You wouldn't, I replied, because you never looked. Brian DeWitt spoke next. Even if such a clause existed, HOA bylaws evolve. They must be enforced uniformly. I turned toward the room, not the board. There's nothing uniform about bullying long-term residents out of their homes. There's nothing legal about inventing infractions and issuing retroactive fines on the basis of personal preference. And there is nothing ethical about manipulating a community for control. I pulled out a second set of documents, photographs, of the recent violation letters I'd received, complete with timestamps showing they were all mailed on the same day. I added notes I'd taken from past board meetings, quotes from other residents who'd received similar citations after minor disagreements with board members. Then came the audio file. A neighbor had recorded a conversation during a compliance inspection in which one of Matt's volunteers stated, "We're trying to phase out the older homes. They're ruining the image." That played loud and clear through my Bluetooth speaker. Gasps, murmurs. A couple of people actually stood up. Matt turned pale. "This is a hearing," he said, voice shaking slightly. "You can't hijack it." I stared at him for a long moment. "You already hijacked this neighborhood. I'm just bringing it home." The board moved to recess the meeting. I gathered my papers, slid them neatly back into the folder, and walked out. Not just as a homeowner, but as the man who reminded them where this place really began. They hadn't expected resistance. They especially hadn't expected it to come from someone who'd once written the very ground rules they were now trying to rewrite. But the fight was just beginning. It started with whispers. Nothing you could write down or prove in court, but you could feel it in the way conversations ended abruptly when I walked into the clubhouse, or how neighbors who once borrowed my ladder now avoided eye contact at the mailbox. Something was shifting subtly, but deliberately. At first, I thought it was just the usual discomfort people had with conflict. After all, I'd spoken up at the last HOA meeting. I'd challenged the board. I had questioned the sudden wave of citations that had come crashing down on older residents, including myself. But as the days passed, it became clearer this wasn't just social discomfort. This was isolation, manufactured and intentional. A week later, I got a call from Alan, a retired engineer who lived 2 streets down. We'd known each other since the early days of Cedar Ridge, back when the lots were still dotted with construction trailers, and the only place to get coffee was a mobile cart near the gas station. Alan didn't waste time on pleasantries. "They're trying to get rid of us," he said flatly. "All of us. What do you mean? He lowered his voice, even though we were both on landlines. There's a plan not on the books, not in the minutes, but I've seen parts of it. They call it the Refresh Project. My stomach tightened. According to Alan, the new HOA leadership, especially Matt Ridley, the young suit-and-tie president who ran meetings like a CEO pitching investors, had been working on a long-term redevelopment proposal. Their goal to transform Cedar Ridge into a high-tier residential enclave, complete with unified architecture, standardized landscaping, and premium leasing opportunities. In other words, a place where custom porches, garden gnomes, and 22-year-old homes like mine no longer fit the brand. I thanked Alan and hung up, heart pounding. Then I went to work. Over the next several days, I started combing through HOA communications, the newsletters, the updates on the website. The subtle language began to emerge, terms like elevated aesthetics, neighborhood modernization, and legacy phase-outs. Terms that sounded positive on the surface but reeked of calculated displacement when you knew where to look. I even found a PowerPoint presentation accidentally left public on their Google Drive titled Vision 2030 Reimagining Cedar Ridge. Slide after slide, it painted a picture of a community I didn't recognize, minimalist landscaping, 3 approved house colors, shared patios. A lifestyle, they called it. A product line. And on slide 17 in fine print at the bottom, legacy lots present image inconsistencies, recommend gradual transitions through incentive buyouts or sustained compliance pressure. Sustained compliance pressure. That's what they called it when they fined Alan for his mailbox being non-standard beige. That's what they called it when they threatened to lien my home over unauthorized shrubs. That's what they were doing to Barbara the widow on Bluebell Court, who'd received 5 violation notices in a single month for her handmade birdhouses. They weren't enforcing rules. They were breaking wills. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of my property with new eyes. My cedar fence, hand-built 2 decades ago and stained every 3 years, suddenly felt like a target. My rose bushes, a gift from my late wife's sister, now looked like liabilities. Everything I loved about my home was on their list of things to erase. Later that day, I received an email marked Urgent HOA Notice. It invited me to a compliance evaluation walkthrough scheduled for the coming week, conducted by 2 board members and a certified external consultant. I printed it out and pinned it next to my original deed. Then I made a call of my own, not to a neighbor this time, but to a contact at the county records office. Her name was Beth, and we'd met back when I volunteered on the civic planning committee years ago. She had access to everything: zoning maps, filing histories, amendment trails. When I asked if she could pull the original filing documents for Cedar Ridge, she didn't hesitate. "I'll have them scanned and emailed to you within the hour," she said. By sunset, I had them. And that's when the final piece clicked. Buried in a supplemental clause, one that I had written as part of the founding committee back when Cedar Ridge was just an idea, was a protective provision, a safeguard for legacy homeowners. It read, "No amendment, regulation, or directive enacted by any future governance body shall supersede the foundational rights of original residents, including but not limited to property design, landscape autonomy, and external fixtures in place prior to the ratification date." I stared at the clause for a long time, my name typed at the bottom as the original author. They didn't know. They had no idea. They were rewriting the future of this neighborhood with the arrogance of people who believed no one had kept the receipts. But I had. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day my daughter was born, in the upstairs room of this very house. Power. Real power. Not the kind granted by position or title, but the kind rooted in history, in truth, in permanence. They wanted me out, but I had built the foundation they were standing on, and I wasn't going anywhere. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was anxious, at least not in the same way I had been for the past few weeks. This time the adrenaline felt cleaner, sharper, like something inside me had reawakened. For the first time in this ridiculous saga, I had leverage. And not just emotional or anecdotal leverage. I had legal weight, cold hard language drafted decades ago and filed with the county, and they had no idea. They thought I was just another holdover from a less polished era. An old man in a custom-built home with rose bushes and cedar posts. The kind of neighbor who waved too long, mowed his lawn diagonally, and told stories at the summer barbecue about how it used to be. A relic, an inconvenience. But they forgot I helped write the story of this place. Literally. Back in the late 90s, when Cedar Ridge was still a swath of empty lots and muddy access roads, I had been one of the 5 original founding members of the HOA Formation Committee. Not because I wanted power, but because I'd spent years in civil code enforcement after leaving the Army, and I knew exactly how things could go wrong when people didn't think through the fine print. I was the guy they asked to draft the deed templates, the guy who structured the early governance documents, the guy who added the protective clauses for long-term residents, veterans, disabled homeowners, and families with multi-generational occupancy. And the kicker, I still had the handwritten notes. They were yellowed, yes. A little curled around the edges, but dated, signed, and notarized. With a cup of coffee in one hand and the scanned documents Beth had sent in the other, I laid out every sheet across my dining table like a general studying battle maps. The wording in the current HOA violation notices was laughably out of sync with the original design philosophy of the neighborhood. Where the board now cited aesthetic uniformity, our founding clause emphasized architectural individuality and environmental harmony. Where they penalized non-standard additions, we had explicitly permitted owner-led enhancements congruent with original intent. And then there was the golden clause, the one I'd rediscovered the night before. I printed out a fresh copy of it in bold, highlighted the entire section, and clipped it to the growing stack of evidence on my kitchen table. I made another copy just in case. Then another which I stored in my neighbor Sarah's fireproof safe across the street. She'd been living here nearly as long as I had, and she hated the new HOA even more than I did. I knew I couldn't just barge into the next meeting and throw papers at them like some unhinged conspiracy theorist. That's not how you win wars with bureaucrats. I needed strategy, patience, precision, so I waited. Let them make the next move. It didn't take long. That Monday, Matt Ridley and 2 other board members, Kelsey, from Lot 15, and Bryce the smug one with the Bluetooth earpiece always clipped to his collar, showed up at my front door with a clipboard, a measuring tape, and someone they introduced as a compliance design consultant. The consultant was in her 20s, wearing square glasses and a tightly wound bun. She didn't smile. She didn't introduce herself. Just looked down at her tablet and said, "We're here for your compliance evaluation." I stepped out onto the porch holding my own folder of documents like a holy relic. "You're on my property," I said, calm but firm. "State your business clearly." "We sent the notice last week," Matt said, motioning toward the sidewalk. "Routine inspection. Just want to make sure you're aligned with the updated community standards." "Your standards weren't voted on by the majority of homeowners," I replied, "and they contradict the original deed." Matt smirked. "Mr. Halston, we understand you've been here a long time, but Cedar Ridge is moving forward. We need everyone to align with the vision. The vision you never got community approval for." The consultant looked up from her tablet. "Sir, this isn't a debate. We're just here to assess compliance." That was my cue. I stepped off the porch, walked calmly past them, and handed Matt a thick manila envelope. "These are certified copies of the original deed protections filed with the county in 1999, I said. "I drafted them myself, and they were approved unanimously by the founding board of which I was a member. I've highlighted the clauses your notices violate." Matt didn't take the envelope, so I handed it to the consultant instead. "You're attempting to enforce bylaws that directly contradict the foundational governing documents of this neighborhood. You're operating outside your authority." For the first time since this nonsense started, Matt looked unsure. Kelsey leaned over and whispered something to him, her expression shifting from smug to concerned. Bryce stopped tapping on his phone. The consultant opened the envelope, flipped through the first page, then another, and her brows furrowed. "Deeply. I'd recommend you read that carefully," I said. "You're flirting with legal liability." Matt adjusted his shirt collar. "We'll review this with our counsel." "You do that," I nodded. "And while you're at it, consider freezing any and all compliance actions against me or any other original residents until that review is complete. Because next time, it won't just be a folder." I let that hang in the air as I turned and walked back inside, shutting the door quietly behind me. My heart was thumping not with fear, but adrenaline. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. That had gone better than I expected. That night, I received no further emails. No violation notices. No HOA harassment. Not yet, but I wasn't naive enough to think they'd back down so easily. Bullies like that don't give up. They regroup. The good news was now I was ahead of them, and I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The next morning I woke up before the sun. Not out of anxiety, but instinct. The way I used to in my army days, eyes opens before the alarm body, already calculating the day's first move. Old habits never really fade. They just wait for a reason to return. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the kind that smelled like purpose, and sat back down at the dining table where I'd left my arsenal of documents the night before. The manila folders, the printed county scans, the original handwritten notes, all of it laid out like the blueprint of a battle plan. Only now it wasn't just about me. It was about everyone. They were trying to steamroll Alan, Barbara, Sarah. Even the quiet couple on the corner who hadn't spoken up but had quietly repainted their porch the same old shade of green after the HOA cited them for non-cohesive aesthetic. We were all targets in a quiet war of erasure. I pulled out the original deed, the real one, the one that didn't exist on HOA letterhead or PDFs updated monthly. The one I drafted 22 years ago, printed on heavy parchment stock, notarized with a press that left a permanent imprint. My signature, bold and deliberate, sat beneath a clause that now stood between them and the power they craved. I ran my fingers over it, feeling not just the ink, but the years, the intentions. The memory of my wife standing in this same kitchen, nodding with pride, as I slid the first copy into a fireproof lockbox. She'd always believed that words could protect as much as walls. Now they had to. I made several more certified copies. I drove one over to the county clerk's office in person and had it officially stamped again, just to eliminate any ambiguity. I scanned and emailed a copy to Beth, asking her to upload it into the digital archive under Cedar Ridge Historical Records. I handed another to Sarah for her safe. And then I did something I hadn't done in years. I wrote a letter to the editor of the community newsletter. It wasn't dramatic. No all caps or accusations, just the facts. To my fellow residents of Cedar Ridge, some of you may be aware of recent compliance actions taken by the HOA against longstanding homeowners. You should know that the original deed drafted, approved, and filed in 1999 includes protections that remain legally binding. I encourage all residents, especially those who've lived here more than a decade, to request a copy of this document and review their rights. Respectfully, Thomas Halston, Lot Number 8 founding member. I included a scanned image of the key clause highlighted and sent it off. They published it 2 days later, and the response was immediate. I started getting knocks on the door again, but this time it wasn't board members. It was neighbors, people I hadn't spoken to in months. Barbara brought over lemon bars and cried when I showed her the deed. Alan nodded, like he'd been waiting for someone else to finally say what he already knew. Even young families, newer ones who'd moved in during the last 5 years, began asking questions about HOA authority and whether it really extended as far as they'd been told. It was like someone had cracked a window in a suffocating room. And with fresh air came something else: resistance. I heard that a few homeowners had begun formally challenging their fines, citing the deed clause. Others were organizing a petition to call for a community-wide vote to suspend enforcement actions until an independent legal review could be conducted. Someone even emailed a local journalist who covered housing disputes. Meanwhile, I kept preparing. I organized everything I had into a presentation. Not flashy, but tight. Bulletproof. I included photos of the original filing records of early meetings and a timeline showing how the new HOA board had incrementally veered away from its original charter. I included a side-by-side comparison of the current bylaws and the founding documents, highlighting every contradiction. This wasn't just going to be a defense. It was going to be an exposé. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A notice went out for the annual HOA Town Hall, an open forum, where residents could voice concerns and board members were required to respond on record. Normally, it was a dull affair: budget reviews, landscaping contracts, water usage reports. Not this year. Word had spread. The clubhouse was full before the meeting even began. Standing room only. People lined the back wall and spilled into the hallway. For the first time in a long time, the community showed up not for a pancake breakfast or holiday parade, but to see if their homes, their stories, their dignity were worth defending. I sat in the third row, binder in hand, eyes on the board. Matt Ridley looked pale. Kelsey kept checking her phone. Bryce tried to smile, but looked more like he was bracing for impact. When the floor opened to residents, I stood, and the room fell silent. No microphone needed. My name is Thomas Halston, Lot 8, resident since 2001. Founding member of the original HOA Charter Committee. I held up the deed, one of the original copies, its seal catching the fluorescent light like a badge of honor. I'd like to speak tonight about the board's recent efforts to systematically target long-standing homeowners under the guise of compliance enforcement. I'd like to remind this room that Cedar Ridge was built on the principle of individuality and community, not uniformity and corporate branding. And I have proof. Then I began, line by line, year by year. I walked them through the language of the original deed, showing how the current board had not only ignored it, but actively violated it. I shared the clause that protected legacy homeowners. I read it aloud slowly. I showed the certified stamps, the notarized dates, the county records, and I watched their faces change. From smug to confused, from confused to nervous, from nervous to afraid. When I finished, I closed the binder and simply said, if this board continues to operate outside the boundaries of the governing documents, I will have no choice but to pursue legal remedies not only for myself, but on behalf of every resident whose rights have been trampled. The next step won't be a meeting. It'll be court. I sat down. The silence was deafening. Then applause. From the back row, then the sides, then the front. It wasn't rowdy. It wasn't angry. It was respectful. Grounded. A community remembering what it meant to be one. The board adjourned the meeting early. No new votes were cast. No compliance actions were mentioned. And I knew as I walked back to my truck that something had shifted. The deed wasn't just paper. It was armor. The days that followed the town hall felt different. Not just in my house, but all over Cedar Ridge. You could feel it in the air like the first crisp morning after a brutal summer when the heat finally backs off and the wind shifts. People weren't whispering anymore. They were talking, openly. Neighbors I hadn't seen in years were suddenly walking by again, stopping at the gate, waving from across the street, asking if I had any extra copies of the deed clause I read aloud. It was as if everyone had been waiting for someone to poke a hole in the wall. And now that it was breached, they were rushing through with stories, frustrations, and questions of their own. Barbara told me her daughter had been fined for overgrown potted plants. Alan's son got cited for a trampoline that had been in their yard for a decade. A young couple with a newborn showed me a notice about their garage paint not matching neighborhood tones, even though it was the same color as the model home. It wasn't just petty, it was strategic, and now we were fighting back. But I knew better than to think public embarrassment alone would stop the HOA board. Bullies don't dissolve when they lose face, they double down. They find new rules to write new loopholes to exploit, and if they're smart, they lawyer up. Matt Ridley and his crew had underestimated me once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. So I started building a case, a real one. I met with a property attorney named Carla Morgan, sharp, seasoned, and not a stranger to HOA litigation. We sat down at her office with all my folders, copies of violation letters, town hall transcripts, and the deed documents. Her reaction after reviewing everything. This is gold. We talked about strategy. Not just a cease and desist, but a class action motion. If we could prove the board was willfully ignoring governing documents, we might be able to get a restraining order on enforcement actions, possibly even force a re-election of the board. She advised patience. Let them make one more mistake. Let them show the court their intent. So I did what I'd been trained to do back in the Service Observe record and prepare. Every letter I received, I scanned and timestamped. Every HOA meeting I attended and took notes, or when I couldn't, I had Sarah record them on her phone. I even installed a small camera facing my front yard, triggered by motion. Nothing illegal, just enough to record if any unauthorized inspections or drive-bys happened again. And they did. Twice. A week after the town hall, Bryce drove by at 6:43 a.m., parked in front of my house, and pointed his phone at my flower beds for 3 minutes. The next morning, Kelsey walked past, my yard paused, and made a call while staring at my porch light. That afternoon, I received a letter citing me for unapproved landscape lighting. It was laughable and exactly what I needed. Proof of retaliation. I added it to the file. Then another surprise arrived in the mail. An emergency board motion notice. A new vote was scheduled. This one wasn't about my violations, but about enacting a new clause. Revocation of legacy protections deemed obsolete for modern governance. I laughed out loud. They were trying to eliminate the deed itself, desperate, and stupid. That was their mistake. Because that vote meant everything would be on public record. It meant they had to explain in front of dozens of witnesses why they were trying to nullify the original document that formed the very basis of Cedar Ridge. It was the opportunity Carla and I had been waiting for. I spent the next 3 days preparing a dossier, not just for me, but for everyone. We printed 40 copies of a packet titled The True History of Cedar Ridge, What the HOA Doesn't Want You to Know. Inside was the original deed, the timeline of board deviations, a glossary of every violation issued in the past 6 months, and testimonies from 8 residents who had received citations that contradicted the founding documents. The night of the emergency vote, I handed them out at the door. No shouting, no picket signs, just paper, information, truth. The clubhouse was once again full. Tension crackled in the air. The board members took their seats at the front like it was a courtroom drama. Matt, straightening his stack of papers, Bryce looking bored, Kelsey pretending to check her tablet. I didn't speak at first. I waited. They opened the meeting, cited their intention to modernize the deed, claimed it was necessary to ensure future growth and prevent liabilities, and then opened the floor for discussion. That was my cue. I stood, binder in hand, calm voice. Before you vote to erase 22 years of legal precedent, I'd like to read a brief statement on behalf of several residents. I pulled out a letter signed by 37 homeowners, formally objecting to the board's motion and citing the original deed as legally binding with statutory protections under state housing law. Then I handed it to the secretary, and then I sat down. Behind me, Sarah stood up, then Alan, then Barbara. One by one, neighbors took the mic and told their stories. Some were angry, some were emotional. All of them were powerful. Matt tried to interrupt several times. Kelsey tried to adjourn the meeting early. But by then it was too late. The tide had turned, and when the vote was called, it failed. Not because the board voted against it, but because over 2/3 of the residents present objected. Under the bylaws, that meant the motion couldn't pass. And just like that, the deed stood, still valid, still binding, still ours. That night, as I walked home under the soft street lamps, a familiar calm settled into my bones. Not triumph, not revenge, just relief and readiness, because the war wasn't over, but the battle was ours. The next official HOA town hall meeting wasn't for another month, but the board couldn't hide behind technicalities anymore. Their failed motion to rewrite the original deed had ignited something real. People weren't just angry, they were awake. Flyers started showing up around the neighborhood, not from me, but from others. One said, "They tried to erase our past. We reminded them who built this place." Another one was bolder. "Want to fix the HOA? Come to the town hall. Bring a chair. Bring your voice." For the first time in years, there was a buzz and energy that didn't come from seasonal garage sales or 4th of July fireworks. This was different, purposeful, unified. By the time the meeting date arrived, I was more prepared than ever. And I wasn't alone. Carla, my attorney, would be there, not as my lawyer, but as a resident advocate invited by several other homeowners. Sarah, now a leader among the newly formed Community Oversight Committee, had collected over 80 testimonies from residents about unfair citations, arbitrary rule changes, and intimidation tactics. The room was packed before 6:00 p.m. We had to open the back doors and bring in chairs from the yoga room next door. People stood along the walls holding printouts of the deed, copies of letters they'd received, and even printed screenshots of Matt's email communications. Someone had leaked them, showing clear bias against longtime residents. I wasn't scheduled to speak, but that didn't matter. The meeting opened with the usual routine attendance minutes from the last gathering and a hurried attempt from Matt Ridley to move into new business. His voice cracked a little. His tie was too tight. Then something remarkable happened. Barbara raised her hand, and instead of waiting for permission, she stood. I moved to suspend the board's control over enforcement actions until a full legal review of the governing documents is completed. Murmurs, then silence. Alan seconded it. Now the board had no choice, they had to address it. Matt fumbled. "That's not how these meetings, normally function, and we'd prefer if—" "Point of order," Carla interrupted from the front row. "According to Article 6, Section B, any resident motion with a second from another resident must be opened for vote if at least 30% of homeowners are present in person or by proxy. By my count, you've exceeded that threshold by double." The room exploded in applause. Cornered. Completely. Kelsey tried to whisper something to Bryce, but he was already sweating bullets. He hadn't said a word all evening. I watched his knee bounce beneath the table, his usual arrogance replaced by a very human kind of panic. They called a 5-minute recess, but we all stayed seated. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, and looked at the rows of familiar faces, neighbors I had shared barbecues with, wave 2 on holidays, once helped dig out after a rare snowstorm. This wasn't just my victory anymore. It was ours. When the board returned, they looked defeated but not yet finished. Matt cleared his throat. We've considered the motion, and in light of recent concerns agree that a pause on enforcement is appropriate. We propose a temporary suspension for 30 days. Groans from the crowd. I stood. 30 days isn't accountability. It's a timeout. What we need is a full audit of the board's actions over the last year, and until that audit is complete, enforcement power should be held in abeyance, and any current fines under dispute should be frozen. The room erupted again. Carla rose and added, and we recommend the formation of an independent review committee composed of residents, not board members, to assist in the legal review of Cedar Ridge's foundational documents. Another resident, Kara, a school teacher who'd lived in the community for 11 years, spoke up. I moved to vote on both proposals. The motions passed, overwhelmingly. And just like that, in the span of one evening, the board's grip began to slip. A vote was scheduled for the following week to select committee members for the independent review. I was nominated, as were Barbara, Sarah, and 3 other residents from various corners of the neighborhood. That night, as the sun dipped behind the tree line and the crowd poured out of the clubhouse onto Juniper Lane, I found myself standing beneath the same dogwood tree where I had first seen the neighborhood 22 years ago. I remembered walking the lot with my wife, imagining our children chasing fireflies, picturing a life built not just of beams and brick, but of belonging. And for a while, we had that. Then came the power grab. But now something new. Not a return to what we had, but something better. A future built on shared responsibility, not control. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a neighbor again. As I turned toward my truck, I heard a voice behind me. Tom. It was Bryce. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets. His face looked softer than usual, tired, maybe even apologetic. I just wanted to say, we didn't know about the original deed. Not until after. And look, I'm sorry. I paused. He meant it. Or maybe he just feared what came next. Either way, it didn't matter. Then step down, I said quietly. Let the community lead. He nodded once and walked away. A week later, the HOA clubhouse wasn't just full, it was transformed. Banners that once promoted HOA-sponsored landscaping contests and seasonal decorating rules had been quietly taken down. In their place stood a corkboard covered in handwritten notes, resident proposals, copies of the original deed, and sticky notes reading things like, "Thank you for standing up for us. We're finally being heard." Cedar Ridge belongs to all of us. The mood in the room was electric, but grounded. This wasn't a pep rally, it was a reckoning. The newly formed Independent Review Committee had spent 4 days combing through every bylaw memo and digital trace from the past 3 years. Sarah led the charge on document cross-checks. Carla handled the legal framework. I focused on pattern recognition, looking for trends in violations, citation demographics, even subtle gerrymandering of so-called improvement zones that disproportionately targeted older homes. And we found them. We found everything. Violation letters signed off before hearings were even scheduled. Emails from Kelsey that included phrases like, "We'll keep pressure on the old-timers until they crack." Financial reports showing beautification funds being rerouted toward renovations for homes recently sold to board member relatives. And perhaps most damning, a hidden clause buried in an internal draft that proposed partnering with a private developer to rebrand Cedar Ridge as a high-end gated enclave. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were rewriting the DNA of the community to squeeze people out and profit in their place. I compiled the findings into a final document titled Cedar Ridge Violated. We handed it out in the same room where just months ago I had read aloud the original deed, like it was some forgotten relic. Now it was the foundation on which we stood. Matt didn't show up that night. Kelsey arrived late, visibly shaken. Bryce hovered near the back, silent. The rest of the board sat stiffly at the front table, their usual smug confidence replaced by the nervous shuffling of papers and darting eyes. We opened the meeting with a motion to present the findings and recommend a full vote of no confidence in the existing board. Carla stood first. Her voice was calm, clinical. The committee has found compelling evidence of systemic misconduct by members of the current HOA board, including, but not limited, to abuse of enforcement authority, failure to disclose financial dealings, and active suppression of resident rights established by the founding deed of Cedar Ridge. She passed around copies of the summary findings. Then Sarah stood. She read aloud 4 resident testimonies. One from a widower fined repeatedly for his non-standard mailbox. Another from a Latina mother of 3, whose unauthorized window curtain color was deemed a community violation. Another from a veteran who was told his service flag violated HOA visibility rules. By the time I rose to speak, the room was silent. Not tense, focused. The kind of silence where every heartbeat feels amplified, every breath a countdown. I didn't need to raise my voice. I simply held up the original deed, now laminated, preserved in archival plastic, and said, "This is not just paper. It is a promise. One that was made when Cedar Ridge was founded. A promise that no one would ever be bullied out of their home or made to feel like they didn't belong. That promise was broken. And tonight we're here to repair it." Then came the vote. Each homeowner present cast a paper ballot. We had prepared in advance, just in case. By the end of the night, the numbers weren't even close. 87% voted to remove the current HOA board. It was done. Legally, the board had 10 days to appeal. But Carla had already drafted an emergency transition provision based on state HOA laws. The homeowners selected 5 interim members to manage operations until a permanent election could be held. And just like that, 22 years after I'd first walked through the half-finished frame of my house, the neighborhood was ours again. The next few weeks felt like a soft sunrise after a brutal storm. Neighbors who had stopped making eye contact were now waving again. People planted flowers not because it was required, but because they wanted to. Alan started a Saturday morning coffee circle at the clubhouse. Barbara launched a community newsletter called The Ridge Report. Sarah began organizing workshops on financial literacy, HOA rights, and neighborhood governance so that no one would ever be blindsided again. As for me, I went back to my garden, tore out the dead grass, reseeded it with native clover, and replaced the old porch light with a warm amber bulb that made the evenings feel golden again. One morning, a delivery truck pulled up. The driver handed me a thick manila envelope with my name on it. Inside was a plaque, walnut wood brushed brass. It read, "In honor of Thomas Halston, for reminding us that home means standing your ground." I didn't hang it up right away. I just held it, let it rest in my lap on the porch as the breeze moved through the trees and the smell of fresh-cut grass drifted down the street. I wasn't a warrior anymore. I was a neighbor, and I was home. The days that followed were quieter, but they carried a weight, a satisfying one. Like when a storm passes and leaves behind the scent of wet earth, the kind that smells like renewal. With the old board gone, the neighborhood didn't suddenly become perfect. There were still minor disagreements about parking spots, paint colors, even the occasional dog barking too loudly. But now they were just that, disagreements. Not threats. Not declarations of war. People talked to each other again. Listened. Laughed. For me, the change wasn't just in policy or leadership. It was in the feel of the air when I stepped out each morning. It was in the nods from neighbors who once walked past with their heads down. It was in the kids riding their bikes again, without fear of a citation for noise disturbance. The interim HOA board held open forums every Saturday afternoon, right there in the clubhouse. No closed-door sessions, no whispered side deals. Everyone got a say and everyone got heard. And when election time came, the community turned out in full. Barbara was voted in as president. Sarah became treasurer. Alan took over community maintenance. We had new blood, 2 young families who brought fresh ideas, but also respected the roots of the neighborhood. I was asked to stay on as historian, an honorary title I accepted with a quiet smile. We rewrote the bylaws together, tore out the language that favored control over cooperation, replaced it with clarity, fairness, and, above all, respect. We reinserted protections from the original deed, codified them into the governing structure so no future board could sweep them away. And we printed copies for every household, not hidden in a dusty file drawer, framed and delivered with a letter that read, "This is your home. This is your voice. This is our community." Some people still called me the guy who wrote the deed. Others just called me Tom. But the truth is, I didn't do it alone. Cedar Ridge changed because the people in it chose to remember what mattered. Not perfectly, not quickly, but decisively. There was one moment in early spring that brought it all full circle. I was pruning back the old rose bushes at the edge of my porch when a boy, maybe 8 or 9, skidded his bike to a stop at my front walk. He had a clipboard under his arm. "Hey, Mr. Halston." I stood up brushing dirt from my gloves. "That's me. I'm doing a school project on community heroes. My mom said I should talk to you." I felt the breath catch in my throat for just a second. Not because I thought I was a hero, but because a kid in this neighborhood now knew that standing up for what's right mattered. That a man in his 60s, armed with only an old piece of paper and a stubborn sense of fairness, could make a difference. I smiled. "Well," I said, walking to the porch steps, "you better come on up then. This might take a while." We talked for nearly an hour. I told him about the old map I drew before the first homes were built, about how we used to plant a tree in every yard on move-in day, about neighbors who became family, and how sometimes families forget each other, lose trust, but can find their way back. When he left, he shook my hand like a grown man and said, "Thank you for saving our neighborhood." I didn't correct him, because maybe in some way that's exactly what we'd done. The deed I wrote all those years ago had started as legal protection, but it became something more, a mirror we could hold up to ourselves. A reminder of what we once promised and what we must promise again. To belong, to respect, to protect. And so I sit here now, years older, a little slower but steadier. My porch is still my favorite place. It's where I hear the laughter of kids playing on summer nights, the buzz of bees in the garden, the slow footsteps of neighbors stopping by just to say hello. The chaos of the old HOA is a memory now, one I don't regret, because without it, we wouldn't have woken up, wouldn't have rebuilt, wouldn't have reclaimed what was always ours. Not just property, not just rules, but community. And as the sun dips low beyond the treetops and the light softens across the shingles of Cedar Ridge, I know this one thing more than ever. They tried to push me out, but I was already home.